And I forgot to unmute the mic. So if you're in the chat saying unmute your mic, then that's all right. You've got to just sit and look at my darkened mug for a good 20 seconds. So welcome to the Got Ancient Wisdom live stream, where we're going to continue reading from Stan Gooch's 1972 book Total Man. Hello to everyone in the chat. At the moment that is 0 people, although I'm sure the only way out is in. The only way out is in the chat. Good evening. The only way out is in. Who has just said sound? Yeah, so I am sound. Thanks. I'm glad you're sound too. It's a little Liverpudlian joke. Haven't changed any of the books around behind me, so you can still see my amazing book collection. The main book you can see, as pointed out last week by Ralph Hexham, Arnold Schwarzenegger's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding. Fascinating read. So we're going to continue, with part 2, which is outlines of consciousness, and the chapter is chapter 3, and it's called Polarity in Language, Connotation and Denotation. So I'm going to start now with this is part 3 of chapter 3. Okay, so we ended on part 2 before. In ancient languages and the language of children, we find traces of a practice which uses one and the same term to express both a quality and its opposite. In modern languages and as adults, we use not one but 2 terms to express such antitheses. When pairs of opposite terms in modern English are examined, one finds that these tend to fall into relatively few conceptual groupings. In the list of paired opposites which follows, and which is in no sense to be considered exhaustive, I have tried to restrict myself to items likely to arouse little dispute. One says little dispute and not no dispute, because in fact not all of the inclusions are equally straightforward. For instance, while science and art, or logic and magic, are not uncomplicated opposites like objective and subjective, or thought and feeling, they do possess a generally antithetical sense, a sense admittedly not easy to define precisely. One would, therefore, enter a plea at this stage for a measure of license on this issue, on the promise of further definition of the position adopted at a later stage when we have considered other evidence. Let me just bring up my 2-shot, because next we've got a graphic. So we've got column A and column B. So we've got objective, opposed to subjective, impersonal and personal, thought and emotion, thinking and feeling, rational and irrational. And then we've got another window that another table that we're going to go to now, which is A and B, and this is obviously a little bit more involved than the other one. So we've got fact versus faith, proof versus belief, logic versus magic or illogical, science, and then we've got religion and art in there, although I would disagree about the art thing. Detachment and involvement, classical and romantic, denotative and denotative and connotative, discrete and associative. The terms within each sublist are not, nor are they intended to be, synonyms, though clearly some are, objective and impersonal, for example. But on the other hand, is there not some kind of within sublist agreement or coherence? Is not objectivity somehow related to proof, just as subjectivity somehow has to do with feeling, and feeling in turn with irrationality? Not to make a long story of this, the proposal is that what one is apprehending as one reads each sublist are the vague or fragmentary outlines of two clusters of somehow related phenomena, perhaps two broad areas of the human personality or of human experience. There is a diversion for children which involves joining up in sequence an apparently random scatter of dots on a page. When this is done, a face or some other picture emerges. If a similar exercise is performed here metaphorically with these pairs and a large number of others which could be produced, what then emerges can be described as the outlines of two continents. One of these, continent B, is seen at once to have close association with what Freud and the psychoanalysts term the unconscious, an obscure shadowed continent, a continent indeed already extensively plundered by the analysts, which may yet, however, contain undiscovered treasures. Does the material we produced in chapters 1 and 2 in any way align with the pair lists A and B? Let us attempt such alignments. So we'll go to the next one. A, day, B, night, A, sky, B, earth, A, smooth, B, hairy, A, asexual, B, sexual, A, light, B, dark, A, angel, and B, devil. These concepts or attributes should now henceforth be considered to have been added to the previous list of pairs. Yet, at first glance, some of these make strange bedfellows for some of the earlier terms. However, if one were obliged to make a choice, and I insist that we do, that is, were obliged to say whether we thought classical form was smooth or hairy, would we not grudgingly choose smooth? And if one had to make the same choice in respect of romantic, would one not, thinking perhaps of poets, settle for hairy? These connections will seem perhaps tenuous. They may become less so in due course. Oh, we've got Ralph Hexham. Hello, Ralph. A further list of paired opposites now follows, which will be seen fairly readily to differ from the paired terms already given above, although some cause for confusion certainly exists. For reasons which will be discussed, the new sublists are headed B1 and B2. So we have good versus bad, kind versus cruel, white versus black, love versus hate or fear, passive versus aggressive or active, God versus devil, relaxed versus tense, warm versus cold, affectionate versus rejecting, and optimistic versus pessimistic. The general comments made about list A, B also apply here. That is, the within sublist items are by no means synonymous, but yet have certain affinities with each other. Thus, if one had to decide whether God was tense or relaxed, one would opt for relaxed, while no doubt protesting that the proposition was ridiculous. Apparent and rather glaring contradictions in these lists will, however, have been noted. We have angel, devil in list AB, and good, evil, God, devil in list B1 and B2. Surely these cover the same ground. Similarly, we have light, dark under AB and white, black under B1 and B2. It is not easy to clear up these difficulties at this stage. The concepts we need to do so are precisely what the present book is attempting to produce. However, it will help first to recall the dual nature of the devil discussed briefly in chapter 2 and the dual nature of knowledge also. One may imagine that a similar duality exists in the concept of God. Consider, for example, the two statements, God is love and God is truth. To some extent, purely semantic difficulties are involved here. As we shall see in due course, two terms are required for a number of what are actually dual concepts, but for which at the moment there exists only one term in each case. More importantly and more relevantly, it must be pointed out that when speaking of such matters as gods and devils, we are dealing essentially with symbols and symbolism. As in dreams, there is nothing to prevent a symbol or content having more than one aspect, or a contradictory make-up of a kind which the rational mind could not and will not accommodate. While it is one thing to translate symbols into the language of common sense for the purpose of discussion, something which this book does continually, this does not cause the symbols either to disappear or lose their inalienable rights as symbols. As far as the light-dark, white-black enigma is specifically concerned, as was pointed out in the previous chapter, the light of list A is essentially that of the day and of sunlight. The white of B1 is variously the pallor of fear, the white of non-sexual arousal, for the colour of sexual arousal, like that of rage, is red. Or the paradoxical whiteness of creatures that live in total darkness, the pale silver white of the moon, or the electrical glow of the firefly, of plankton and of deep-sea fish. The headings of the later list B1 and B2 will have revealed the relationship of list AB, or rather list B alone, to list B1, B2. The opposites of B1, B2 are contained within the terms of list B. For example, religion, list B, contains both God and the devil. Emotion contains both love and hate. One may express the position in diagram form as follows. This is getting quite. It gets quite not confusing, but it becomes like algebraic at this point. So we have list A and list B, and then we have a subdivision of B into B1 and B2. The diagram may be itemized science, religion, and then in religion we have God and devil, and thought, emotion, and then in emotion we have love and hate. So and then we've got another chart on page 87, and this goes into a few more of these relationships. Logic, magic, and we've got in magic white magic and black magic, and then detachment and involvement, and then we've got involvement pro and contra, and then objective, subjective, and we have optimistic and pessimistic, and then quantitative versus qualitative, and we have good and bad qualities. Ralph Hexham saying duality is what underpins Gnosticism. Yeah, that's true. I think some of this could be considered Gnosticism, couldn't it? I think. Naturally, one could spill seas of ink over the definitions of the terms involved. That, however, is precisely what we are not going to do. Nonetheless, one can agree that some of the terms in the earlier lists would not sit as easily in this form. Art, for example. The fact of the matter is that a further dimension still is needed to accommodate certain aspects of these words and concepts, and this will be among the subjects of later chapters. It may not have gone unnoticed that the terms male or female have not so far been placed. The fact is that these belong in both major divisions. The resultant paradox is... Have I got this? No, I don't have this one. So we've got A, male. I should have it. Hold on a minute. Give me a second. Let me just... too short. Slides. Sorry about this. I'm just checking to see what slides I've got. Slide 9. What it is that I didn't actually prepare this slide. That means we've probably got a couple of slides coming up that also haven't been prepared. So very, very bad got. I'll see if I can load them up. Hold on. Let me just see if I can. One sec. Right, those ones there. Okay. So let's save that. Sorry about this. I'm working on the fly. Transform. Fit to screen. Okay, so we should be able to get something here if I just... Okay. Send that over there. Right, so let me just flick through some of these, see if I can get to the ones that we're meant to be on. There you go. So we have A, male, B, female, B1, female, and B2, male. And then this gives us male opposed to female, and then inside female, female, male. There is, however, no contradiction, although certainly possibilities. There is, however, no contradiction, although certainly possibilities for confusion exist. Recalling some of the propositions in Chapter 2, the expanded paradigm becomes asexual male opposed to sexual female, and then sexual female is then subdivided into anti-sexual female and sexual male. The terms asexual male and anti-sexual female are used deliberately. It is now suggested that the female principle, can never be anything else but sexual. The word sexual is, from some point of view, an unfortunate term, but one which we are obliged to continue to use for the moment. This principle can deny sexuality, but it cannot be outside it or not part of it. Only the male principle, can be asexual. Women readers may feel sardonically that the idea that men are asexual is news to them. Part of the trouble here, once again, is that we are speaking at once and the same time of symbolic and of literal values of the world of symbolism and the world of everyday. This present area in particular does not allow of the easy separation of these components. Let us attempt, nevertheless, a more purely symbolic pattern or paradigm. In doing so, we bring out a further problem. All the personality elements under discussion here are present in the personality of every single human individual, whether male or female. The emphasis on particular elements tends, of course, but only tends, to be rather differently placed in the human male and female. When, therefore, one speaks of the female aspects of personality, one is not at all suggesting that these elements are absent in the male, but the expression and experience of those same elements in the male is not identical with the expression of those elements in the female. Thus, there is male femaleness and female femaleness, and of course female maleness, etc. There are no absolute values for these various components. Their value is moreover related to and a function of the total matrix of interrelating events and values which make up the complex personality of the individual. With this further addition to our problems, the following alternative is proposed to the sex paradigm above. We got that? Yes. Wizard, angel, God is truth, opposed to man, and then man, subdivisions, virgin, God is love, and witch, devil. This version usefully underlines the asexuality of the figures on the far left. They are singletons only, not pairs, because they are outside sex and not therefore divided into male and female. Man is both and separately male and female. A single term is used in order not to overcomplicate the diagram and should be understood to stand for mortal male, mortal female. The mortal represents the human being living in the narrowest band of conventional experience. We all know what happens to mortals who wander outside this band. They become all manner of wonderful and terrible things. The paradigm also brings out the dual nature of God, and further the contrast between the virgin, God, love without sex, and the witch, devil, sex without love. Nevertheless, it must be insisted that in the very broadest sense of these terms, all the figures mentioned in the preceding paragraph, those on the right of the diagram, are still both sexual and of the female principle, and it must still be stressed that despite their asexuality, the wizard and the angel, etc., those on the left of the diagram, are nonetheless, in a sense, we cannot yet adequately defined of the male principle. List A, then, somehow refers to the sphere of influence of the male principle, while List B is concerned with the sphere of activity of the female principle. These two principles and their characteristics are opposites. Within one of these, the B principle, exists a further set of linked opposites. As we have seen, Freud frequently stated that opposites are very close in the unconscious. May this be taken to imply that opposites outside the unconscious mind are not close? Of direct relevance here is the fact that the opposites described by the same words in older languages, the antithetical primal words, as Freud called them, in general fit far better into list B1, B2 than into list AB. So, have we got that one? Yes. B1, sacred, opposite to B2, accursed. Then we've got guest, an enemy, weak and strong, adhere to and split off, and then with and against. In everyday life, we speak of love-hate relationships. Let me just go back to the main shot. In everyday life, we speak of love-hate relationships and of the dividing line between love and hate as a razor's edge. Other phrases in common use, such as manic-depressive and approach avoidance, further support the idea of some kind of oscillatory movement between opposites. The very existence of the term trust implies its opposite, distrust and fear. Love and hate are opposites, but they are, as it were, two sides of the same coin. True, opposites are not part of each other. We have arrived here at one of the central dialectics of the Christian faith in justifying the existence of evil in the universe, that if we did not know, did not have evil, we would be unable to recognize good. We cannot choose good, it is argued, unless there is evil to reject. So, for example, Christ was tempted by the devil in order that he might declare his hand one way or the other. In contrast to this position, when we consider the opposites of list AB, we find that thought and emotion, for example, do conceptually exist by themselves in their own right. Similarly, neutrality or detachment is not involvement. It is neither for nor against. Proof does not require the existence of faith, neither does disbelief destroy proof in that sense, even if it refuses to recognize it. Faith is irrelevant to proof, and by the same token, proof is irrelevant to faith. Thought is thought in the way that a rose is a rose is a rose. It could itself exist in a universe which had never heard of emotion, the overworked plot, actually, of many science fiction stories. Thought can say that good and evil are only concepts, mere semantic opposites that exist only in the mind. Rephrase them in non-emotional terms, and the problem of these opposites disappears. Fremen on the Sand. I heard that the old definition of against and for are the same. I think we talked about that last week, actually. Yeah, for and against. Yeah, that might have been earlier in the other chapter. So it is clear from the foregoing that any embodied female principle, list B, would have the greatest difficulty in genuinely comprehending the male principle, list A, and vice versa. Strictly speaking, this is impossible. Insofar as the attempt is made in real life, the female side of the personality nevertheless perceives the male subjectively, while the latter perceives the former objectively. Each principle, as it were, projects or lends its own characteristics to what is perceived. Thus, for example, the female principle must perceive in terms of opposites, the opposites naturally of B1 and B2. Of this, a typical instance is the slogan, "Those who are not with us are against us." I mean, this is 1972. We all know what that phrase is from. It's from Star Wars. The reverse, "Those who are not against us are with us," also holds, if not so thrillingly. But no third possibility exists. There can be no neutrality. So runs the dogma of all types of commitment. The female principle cannot and will not understand the regard that neither praises nor condemns, neither accepts nor rejects, neither judges nor pardons. Detachment is anathema to the female principle. Returning to the notion that those who are not against us are with us, something further is accounted for. On first making the acquaintance of objective knowledge, that is, of knowledge 1, and finding it not hostile per se, because it is not involved with hostility or any other emotion, principle B concludes that knowledge must therefore be with and therefore good. Only after a time is it realized that knowledge, objective knowledge, is outside good and evil and has an equal place for both, i.e. no place for either. At that point, principle A, knowledge 1, becomes an enemy because, of course, those who are not with us are against us. What have we got in the comment? Ralph Hexham, frenemies is the new term for good old Schadenfreude on social media. Fremen on the Sand, is that the proper way of saying reals over feels? Reals over frills. Objective equals reals. Okay. You have to repeat what the bit that you're saying. What is that the proper way of saying reals over feels? Religion at this point turns against knowledge, just as the state turned against Socrates, and for precisely the same reasons. At that moment, the devil is he who knows. One need hardly recall that Adam was expelled from Eden on the day he acquired knowledge, and that this was specifically knowledge of good and evil. The emergence of objective understanding is the death knell of the rule, the oneness, of the female principle. This is one of the further layers of the Genesis legend. In concluding this section, it is worth emphasizing that the broad dichotomy we have here described in terms of lists A and B is not itself some hypothetical arrangement. Only the terms A and B are that. The dichotomy, for instance, between scientific or neutral words and words carrying an emotional charge exists. If it does not, then why do the terms themselves exist? And what on earth do we understand by them when we use them? A brief selection, not now of single words but of statements, follows, each of which is based implicitly on this dichotomy. My heart wanted God, but my head got in the way. Alfred de Vigny. The heart has its reasons. He's all head and no heart. Business and pleasure don't mix. Never do business with friends. Don't bring feelings into this. The situation looked different in the cold light of day. I pinched myself to make sure I wasn't dreaming. One must allow for the human element. People are not machines. Man does not live by bread alone. The position suggested appears to have some kind of reality. The assumption that there are two distinct ways of looking at life underlies each of the above statements. Of course, whether or not one then goes on to accept the model of personality which I in part base on this situation is another issue. From here, we are in a position to proceed to some evidence provided by physiology, the observed physical properties of the human nervous system. This is not at all to say that speculation on the relevance of language or other psychological phenomena is exhausted. On the contrary, continuing stress will be placed upon language, in particular on the history, in most cases the forgotten history, of words. It is not, for example, an accident that villain, the devil's descendant, is in origin the same word as vilain, meaning a peasant, as one might have predicted, a man of the earth. So you were talking of Fremen on the land, on the sand says, so you were talking about objective masculine versus subjective feminine. Yeah. And searching for the truth is masculine, it's objective, it hurts feelings sometimes. Yes, okay, yeah, that's fine, yeah, that's good. Objective is reals. Yes, I suppose you could put reals in one column and feels in the other column. You could say column A was reals and column B was feels. So we're at the end of that chapter. I'm just going to find my slide so that I can load up the next chapter. Chapter 4. And then if there's no more questions, we can just go straight into chapter 4. Where is it? Right. I think I've got it. Ralph Hexham is saying testosterone versus estrogen. Yeah, I guess so. That could be one of the influences on these systems. And then the only way out is saying those feelings that the objective truth might hurt aren't real feeling. They're emotions or conflict, which are just reactions, equals ego, i.e. imagined, built up self versus real self. That's a good point. So this is chapter 4, Polarity in the Nervous System. In the previous chapter, a tentative infrastructure for the human personality was proposed on the basis of certain linguistics and other evidence. This model divided the personality into two major parts, A and B, whose respective spheres of influence are both opposite and conceptually independent. Within B are two further subdivisions, B1 and B2, whose functions, though again opposite or antagonistic, are this time conceptually interdependent. That is to say, B1 and B2 are the two sides of one coin, and not, as in the case of A and B, two different coins. The question to be considered now is whether any physiological support can be found for this psychological model. Physiology, it should be said, is the study of the function of the structures and organs of the body, that is, of the brain, glands, nerves, muscles, and so on. System B, master race here. That's Zeitgeist zu Preferde in the chat. Weltgeist zu Preferde. Psychologists in general look to physiology to provide the physical basis of personality, the physical hardware which underlies the psychological software. Physiologists divide the body and its various organs into a number of systems. One such overall division, the one with which we shall be principally concerned in this chapter, is into the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. This division is one commonly accepted by psychologists and physiological psychologists. It should be emphasized, however, that it is not the only one possible. The central nervous system comprises essentially the brain and the spinal cord and the large majority of structures found within those. The autonomic nervous system embraces groups of coordinating centers in function, not unlike parts of the brain, which lie outside the central system, as well as certain sections of the brain itself and perhaps most typically the various glands of the body. The central system controls the skeletal or striped muscles and voluntary movements of these. It is exteroceptive, that is, it responds to stimuli outside the organism. One of its major functions is to make adjustments in the external environment. The autonomic system is enteroceptive, that is, it responds principally to stimuli from within the organism, temperature change, hunger, fatigue, and so on. It regulates the functioning of the glands and the internal organs, that is, it makes adjustments to the internal environment. To this end, it also has control over the so-called smooth muscle, e.g. the muscles of the heart. Lastly, this system can, when necessary, produce involuntary or reflex movements of the striped muscle. These two basic properties, one, the means by which organisms react to and move themselves about in the environment, contractility, and two, the maintenance of internal equilibrium by means of secretion and excretion, are found even in the most primitive organisms. Central nervous system. It will be helpful to refer to the figure between pages 241 and 244 when reading these sections. I don't think I've got those lined up. Under this heading are considered for the moment only the cerebral hemispheres, that is the cerebral cortex and the hypothalamus. There are, of course, many other organs involved. 1. The cerebral hemispheres and cerebral cortex. The leading role in the central nervous system is played by the outer covering of the two cerebral hemispheres, the cerebral cortex. The cortex is the heavily wrinkled external part of the brain immediately visible on removal of the skull. The term neocortex, new cortex, is frequently also used since a large part of the cortex constitutes the most recently developed features of the nervous system in evolutionary terms. This development reaches its peak in man, and the neocortex is in fact the seat of the most typically human abilities. During the known evolution of man, average brain size has increased from 600 to 700 cubic centimeters, or centiliters maybe, to 1200 to 1300 cc, most of the increase being neocortical. It is on the basis of considerable experiment and observation that the cortex is known to be the center of volitional motor movement and the major terminus of sensory impressions. This part of the brain is likewise the seat of cognitive functions, thought and waking consciousness. Moreover, the learning of new skilled activities is organized by the cortex. Language and speech are the concern principally of the temporal lobes at the lower rear side of the surface of the brain, and here also is situated the memory store. Electrical stimulation of the temporal cortex produces, astonishingly enough, random scenes from one's past life in toto, as originally observed, together with the emotional feelings which accompanied them. The temporal lobes also house one of the several sleep centers of the nervous system. Not only volitional control of motor movement, but apparently volition generally, perhaps what used to be termed will, resides in the cortex, particularly it seems in the frontal lobes. The development of these lobes is the most distinctive feature of the brains of primates, particularly of man. Experimental lesions or accidental damage in this area produce a marked, sometimes a drastic drop in general drive and the will to achieve. Don't get dropped on your head. Of great relevance here is the demonstration physiologically that stimuli originating in the cortex can block outright or otherwise modify impulses from centers lying below the hemispheres, perhaps emotional centers. Ideas can frequently produce such controlling or modifying blocks. This fact is, of course, self-evident on the mental plane. Commands such as pull yourself together, for heaven's sake act like a man, think of the children, etc., may, though do not necessarily, have the effect of calming an hysterical individual, of overcoming panic, or rousing someone from a state of shock or torpor to a state of action. It has additionally been shown experimentally that, say, the name of a man's girlfriend or wife spoken while he is asleep is more likely to wake him than any other girl's name spoken at the same intensity. The cortex, therefore, can put an end to sleep when necessary. Alcohol, too, first depresses the higher centers, releasing lower behavior, which is normally held in check. As we all know, this often constitutes undesirable or animal cavortings, but can comprise merely simple indiscretions or the betrayal of secrets or simply an increase in affection. In vino, what's the phrase? In vino, in wine, truth. What is it? In vino vero or something. These various kinds of evidence all demonstrate that without any effort on the part of the individual, normal cortical consciousness is restraining or modifying a good deal of would-be behavior. The cortex is therefore far from being a helpless victim of unconscious. The cortex is therefore far from being a helpless victim of unconscious or emotional impulses. Right? Yeah. It's a control center where you control yourself. Ralph Hexham is saying he's been hit over the head with 2 bottles and an iron bar so far. Oh, excuse me. Well, as long as you've been hit in the right place, Ralph, and you also might have a thick skull, which is another phrase that we use, isn't it? Of like he's got a thick skull, so it's someone who's can't be got to easily. Maybe someone who can't be swayed from their mission or from their, from their sort of their way of being. Anyway, back to the book. What remains true is that as the autonomic system, to be more fully described below, is aroused, impulses from it to the cortex become progressively stronger. Thus one speaks of rising excitement or mounting anger, and more difficult for the cortex to control. A relatively small amount of subcortical stimulation causes the cortex to function more efficiently. Arousal beyond that rather low level, however, causes a deterioration in performance. We all know that in states of even fairly moderate anger or anxiety, it becomes difficult to perform such simple tasks as inserting a key in a lock or pouring a drink without spilling it. When stimulation reaches a point where the cortex is flooded, we then experience states such as overwhelming panic, blinding rage, or dazzling ecstasy. The loss of control experience is a common enough sensation, and to this we shall revert. 2. Hypothalamus. The hypothalamus lies below the thalamus, an organ not of direct concern to the present discussion. Although connected with the thalamus, which is part of the central nervous system, and despite its name, the hypothalamus has a large measure of independence. It is, in fact, much more part of the autonomic system, constituting that second system's highest level of integration. Contained in this small structure are the most highly evolved centers for the regulation of sexual functions, aggression, general emotion, body temperature, hunger, thirst, and so on. Like a number of other centers, it also controls sleep. The autonomic nervous system. As a generalization, it can be said that whereas the central system is primarily a motor system controlling the muscles and volitional action, and only in second place a sensory system, the autonomic is primarily a sensory system controlling the glands and inner states of the organism, and only in second place a motor system. The autonomic system does, however, as already mentioned, control the smooth or involuntary muscles and reflex actions of skeletal muscles. The term autonomic means effectively automatic. The more precise meaning is self-governing. This is to say, the autonomic system is not only under our volitional control, that is, we cannot in general consciously affect its operation, but it will frequently override or operate in advance of the rulings of the central system, particularly in emergencies of all kinds. A person will find, for instance, that he has removed his fingers from a hot object before consciously appreciating that it is hot. More complexly, we may find ourselves running away against our will in the face of danger, even despite a conscious effort to stay and be brave. A person, too, who tries to stay awake indefinitely succeeds only in the short term. Similarly, it is not possible to hold one's breath until one becomes unconscious. The autonomic system is itself divided into two subsystems, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. This division is based on a variety of objective considerations. For example, the sympathetic nerves act by liberating noradrenaline into the space between their endings and the structures on which they work, while the parasympathetic nerves liberate acetylcholine. Structurally, the synapses of the parasympathetic system, a synapse is a junction in the nerve, are found in isolated groups of ganglia, masses of nerve bodies, adjacent to the gland or organ controlled, while the synapses of the sympathetic system are organized mainly in chains of ganglia lying along the spinal column. As a corollary to this, the action of the parasympathetic system is piecemeal, while the sympathetic system tends to function as a whole. So we're seeing opposites in these things as well. What's Ralph saying now? Yep, the autonomic, having been hit over the head and then being able to get myself out of danger, may have come from somewhere other than in my brain. Yeah. Okay. Presumably you got yourself out of danger when you got hit over the head. Or did you end up in hospital? Describing the general functioning of these two subsystems. Have we missed a page? No, I think we're all right. No. Describing the general functioning of these two subsystems, a standard text has the following to say. The two divisions of the autonomic system are largely, although not completely, antagonistic in their effects. In general, the sympathetic system mobilizes the resources of the body for use in work and special emergencies, while the parasympathetic conserves and stores bodily resources. In other words, the first helps spend bodily resources and the second helps save them. This statement, although true, does not hold in certain specific instances. Naturally, too, these systems never act independently of each other, but are brought into correlated activity in varying degrees, depending on the demand made on the organism. Quote, finish quote. Of particular interest, perhaps, is the phrase, never act independently of each other. And now we go on to 1, the sympathetic system and the posterior hypothalamus. An experimental physiology has effectively demonstrated the posterior or rear end of the hypothalamus is the chief regulator of the sympathetic system. This system prepares the organism for the emergency reactions of fight and flight, rage and fear. Its action, therefore, is variously to augment the blood supply to the brain and muscles while denying it, for example, to the stomach to inhibit saliva, and in brackets, mouth dry with fear. To increase the heart rate, his heart raced. To inhibit the secretion of gastric juices, hence bad temper and indigestion, as well as fear and indigestion go together, and to inactivate the alimentary and urogenital canals. The phenomenon of defecating and uricating in extreme fear is due not to sympathetic action, but to a prior burst of parasympathetic activity. 2. The parasympathetic system and the anterior hypothalamus. Experimental stimulation of the anterior or frontal hypothalamus sets the effect of the parasympathetic system in operation. This system encourages the secretion of gastric juices, aids digestion, facilitates salivation, urination, defecation, and aspects of sexual readiness, such as erection of the penis. Here is also located one of the so-termed pleasure centers. When an electrode is implanted in such a center, an animal will endlessly press the lever which activates the electrical current. A rat or monkey will stimulate itself for as long as 48 hours at a stretch, oblivious of other needs till it drops with exhaustion. The anterior hypothalamus is also concerned with the regulation of body temperature. In this connection, it is interesting how many terms relating to temperature we apply to sex. A sexually active female is called... Oh, excuse me, quite a big yawn. Oh, tired boy today. We've got to remember this is 1972 as well, and Stan was like about 40 years old when he wrote this. A sexually active female is called a hot woman. Hot lips is a vulgar term of sexual endearment. A bitch ready for copulation is said to be on heat. We speak of being aflame with desire, of burning passion. Affectionate people are called warm. Reserved people are cold. The anterior hypothalamus regulates also hunger and thirst. One speaks, interestingly, of hunger for love and affection, and one is consumed with desire. Life without love is called empty. Is called empty. What has been said thus far is now summarized and its implications considered. The central system is primarily a doing or motor system, while the autonomic is chiefly a feeling or sensual system. The former is also a thinking system and active by day, i.e. during waking hours, at which times, under normal conditions, it controls or modifies impulses of autonomic origin. In emergencies or in states of drunkenness and similar conditions, the autonomic system can, wholly or partly, override this central control. The autonomic system, therefore, also functions by day, but it is additionally a night system, at least in the sense that it controls sleep, and perhaps too in the sense that dreams contain generous helpings of sex, aggression, fear, and other autonomic responses. It is also true that vital functions such as breathing and digestion continue uninterrupted throughout the night. The central system, however, is then largely inactive. In some sense, therefore, the two systems are alternatives. And certainly it is impossible, for instance, to think clearly and be in a state of panic at one and the same time. The autonomic system is itself divided into two closely linked, though in general antagonistic, subsystems. The characteristic mode of the sympathetic system is arousal, tension, and activity. The parasympathetic system is characterized by quiescence, relaxation, passivity, and vegetation. It will now be clear where this consideration of the nervous system has led us. For the sake of the record, however, this is now spelled out. First, a roundup and juxtaposition of the terms applied by physiologists to the central and autonomic division of the total nervous system. Right, I'm going to have to just quickly load up a graphic for you because it's quite an important one. Add. I think it's that one, that one, that one, that one. Okay, hopefully none of these have got my hand in them. That would be a bit weird. Just going through them now. Oh, hold on. Let me just. I might have to transition the shot again. Sorry, we're near the end, but these are quite interesting charts I'm trying to find. If I've got them, that is. I don't know if I've even got them. Okay, doesn't look like we've got them. Okay, I'll read them out instead. So we've got two tables. We've got central nervous system and autonomic nervous system. And so everything I read first is central nervous system, and then it's autonomic nervous system. So we've got primarily motor, and then primarily sensual. And then we've got doing and thinking opposed to feeling. We've got voluntary opposed to involuntary. We've got day, waking, opposed to night, sleeping. We've got exteroceptive opposed to interoceptive. We've got looks out opposed to looks in. We've got neo opposed to paleo. So it's the new system opposed to the old system. We've got cortical and subcortical. We've got human and animal / sex. Are these not the kinds of alternatives already seen in the previous chapters in lists A and B? The terms applied to the parasympathetic and the sympathetic subsystems provide us with some further close correspondences to our earlier groupings, this time in terms of lists B1 and B2. So B1 is the parasympathetic and B2 the sympathetic. So we've got B1 or parasympathetic quiescence, passivity, opposed to activity, aggression, fear and arousal. We've got conservation opposed to mobilization. We've got save and expend. We've got digestion and then interrupted or disturbed digestion. Thus, the psychological structures earlier proposed appear in very broad terms to be paralleled by structures independently described by physiologists on an objective and experimental basis. Paradigms here are as follows. So now we're back to our sort of algebraic chart. And this is central nervous system opposed to autonomic nervous system, and then the autonomic nervous system is split into parasympathetic and sympathetic. Then we've got doing opposed to feeling, and then in feeling we've got for and against. And then we've got exteroceptive versus interoceptive, and in interoceptive we have conservation and mobilization. If paradigms are a little thin on the ground here, this is partly because one is considering the relatively simple and physiological points of origin of complex psychological phenomena. Despite what some physiologists appear to think, physiology, from the behavioral or experimental standpoint, is an extremely gross and coarse description of human organisms. Thus, if one asks a physiologist what the physiological correlates are of pathos, loyalty, sentimentality, longing, admiration, cynicism, whimsicality, fortitude, remorse, firmness, insolence, etc., he has, for the time being at any rate, no answer. Nonetheless, the parallels described between our two levels of explanation, the psychological and the physiological, appear undeniable. Man's psychological experience and the physical basis of that experience are not merely linked, but are perhaps so on a scale and in ways that are not currently imagined. The shape of conscious may prove to have something very much to do with the physical shape of the nervous system. The central system as a whole is a doer, i.e., it is volitional and controls the normal means of body movement. The autonomic system as a whole is a feeler, i.e., it generates and transmits emotions. The autonomic experiences of anger and fear, however, lead to action, fight or flight. Thus we have doing, male, opposed to feeling, female. And in female, we have passive, female, and we have active, male. A point of additional interest is that in both parts of this physiologically based paradigm, it is the male element which is active and the female element which is passive. So I think we'll stop there because we're at an hour, and then we're at the third part of that chapter, which is another 1, 2, 3, 4. I mean, there's quite a lot in there, and there's some drawings in there that I probably should put in because it's drawings of the brain. And if I haven't got them in, then it'll probably, some things won't make sense. So it's probably best that I do put those in. So sorry that I ran out of drawings towards the end of this part of chapter 4. But I think there's quite interesting. I hope you're starting to get a feel of how Stan Gooch works. The only way out is in. Is said. Oh, good, because I'm off to bed to get the old HGH in. Okay, that's good. That's good. Yeah, that's it. Everyone should just get a bit of sleep. So that's why I'm also finishing early, so that you can all get some sleep. And then Michael Carley, is that coming yet? Gooch was ahead of the curve on things. Yeah, I think so. And that's why I'm really doing this reading, is because I want more people to get a grasp of like, probably this is someone who we've missed, who's been sort of like overlooked, and actually had some like really spot on observations, and we're gonna get into more as the book goes on. And then also, there are several other books that contain absolute gold in them. And yeah, it's a real travesty that no one knows who Stan Gooch is. Yeah, so I hope you're starting to get a sort of idea of how he works. Is he's gonna lead you into sort of quite orthodox pathways, so that he doesn't just come out with rubbish. He takes you into like the orthodox understanding of something, and then uses it. It's like a jujitsu. So he uses it to sort of back up a new idea that everybody seems to have missed. Something that's been staring everyone in the eye. But it is also to do with that the organ that we're using to examine itself. So we're using a brain to examine itself, And so obviously the brain is the worst thing you can use to examine itself, because it's going to have some biases and it's going to keep some information locked away from you so that you can't access it. And then Michael Carley has said Neanderthal interbreeding. Yeah, Gooch was putting this forward in 1973 I mean, he does. We will touch on it in Total Man, but really, it's his third book, the Neanderthal Question, the NQ. That's the one where he really goes into detail about the Neanderthal interbreeding thing. Oh, that's when he first sort of like the spark finally clicks in his head that like, oh right, okay, so maybe we're some kind of hybrid, and that all of these antagonistic oppositions in our mind are all from our cross instincts that we've inherited. We've inherited two pairs of instincts, and that there's no turning back now. We can't really go back to being just an animal with one set of instincts. We've fallen. We've left the Garden of Eden. But yeah, so I hope everyone's enjoying it so far. Thanks everybody in the chat. Thanks for coming in and talking to each other and talking to me and asking questions and making comments. And just try and share it around as much as you can. Tell a friend to come and listen. I'm going to try and put the chapters into concise, cut down chapters, so that I can put them on the other platforms, your BitChutes and your bloody other MySpace or whatever else people use now. Then I can sort of, once I've got a couple of chapters under the belt, I'll start cutting them into little sections, into each chapter at a time. So thanks. The Only Way Out is in. Michael Carley, Ralph Hexham, Fremen on the Sand. Yeah, you guys, brilliant. And I'm going to go to the outro now. Bye bye, everyone. See you next week.